So I think as we head into the beginning of chapter 7, what theme do you see that's continued there? What's the theme that's been all of 6 and now leading into 7? What's 7 tell us at the beginning? What's Noah been doing up to this point?
Obeying.
That's right, obeying God. So we got from all the rebellion, all the pain on all the earth in Genesis 5, and then Genesis 6, we get into God asking Noah to do everything that he needs him to do in order to save the human race and all the animals. And then as we begin into 7, when the rains get ready to start, we see that Noah is responding. We see that Noah decides at this point in chapter 7 to follow God. And when he decides to follow God, when he responds to God, we see that he's able to do amazing things for the kingdom and for the entire human race. And that's one of the most important aspects of Genesis 7. Is what we see in 6 that, remember in 5, people began to call on the name of the Lord. And then 6, people began to rebel toward God. And in the midst of 6, we saw at the same time that God had found the one righteous family, and that was Noah and his family. And so then he'd asked Noah to do all these things, piece by piece, step by step, and Noah decided that he was going to do it. Noah had responded. He built the ark just like God had told him. In the midst of everything going on, in the midst of all the ridicule that was likely happening, he decided to go ahead and listen to God, to follow God, and respond to God like he did. And so throughout 7, we see that theme fulfilled. We see that following God's instructions just like he told Noah to do it was of utmost importance. So why do you think that God chose Noah, knowing that Noah is doing all these things that God's asked him to do? What did God see in Noah? Obedience. God saw faithfulness. God saw obedience. God saw someone who would do what's asked of him. You see, God gave Noah this task because in all his ways of living, Noah was the only righteous person on all the earth. And we see that lived out in Noah's life throughout chapter 7. We'll see later how important it is that Noah built the ark to the dimensions that God instructed him. So we begin with 7, seeing that theme continued, and at the same time, we see this difference between the clean animals and unclean animals. So why do you think that God would differentiate between those two groups? Why would God ask for 7 pairs of the clean animals and only 1 of the unclean?
They needed more of the clean animals to eat, and I guess maybe to sacrifice.
Right. Sacrifices and for eating. Now the purpose of the unclean animal, one scholar explains, was just to reproduce. So that's why there was only 2 of all those different animals. But then with the clean animals, they were even more important because they were used as a way that Noah could, when him and his family would sin, they would make sacrifices using those animals and be made right with God. Because this punishment for sin was what? Death, that's right. And so Noah had to have a way to fulfill that redemption story that God has with his people at the time. And so following God's instructions there is of utmost importance. Because in order to be able to sacrifice, in order to be able to have this food that they wanted to eat, they had to obey God and take the proper number of animals. And we see in this amazing, amazing way of leading all these animals to the ark that Noah did exactly what God had asked of him. He got 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth, verse 3. And then God gives Noah this warning, this very specific warning. And when y'all think about what impression that would have left on Noah, right? God had told him, listen, you've got to obey what I'm going to say if you want to save all these people, all these animals. And then God gets really specific with him in verse 4. 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And then hear the warning. And I'll wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made. Do you hear God's grief in the midst of that sentence? He doesn't just say, I'll wipe from the earth everything living. He includes the description that I made. God's saying, I will destroy everything that I made. He's talking about this creation that he was so filled with love that we talked about that he just had to create. He just had to bring into existence. He just wanted it to exist. And now he's making the statement that he has to destroy everything that he made, that he created, that he brought here out of love. I think that's one of the big parts of chapter 7, as we talked about with 6, is that throughout all these things that are going on, we see God's grief at work. We see God's pain. We see God's suffering because he's having to destroy the creation that he created out of love, out of joy, that he just wanted us to exist. Now he has to destroy it. But verse 5 brings us more hope. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. There's our theme continuing. And then we get descriptions about Noah's age. And then we have this: the floodwaters came on the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife, and his sons' wives, they all entered the ark. And then verse 8 tells us that they took all the pairs of clean and unclean animals, all the creatures that move along the ground. They come to Noah and enter the ark, as God commanded Noah. There's that theme again. And after the 7 days, like God had told him, the floodwaters came on all the earth. So we have another description in verse 11 about Noah's age. And then a very specific date, month, and day. 17th day of the second month. Now notice here what happens in verse 12. The water comes from where first? The springs of the earth, right? It comes from the springs of the earth. The rain starts. All this water starts to flood the earth. But I think it's interesting here that the water just doesn't come from the sky. It also comes up out of the ground. It also comes from every area which God had created. He didn't just make it come from the sky. He made it come from the earth as well. And in 11 and 12, we see the intensity of the violence going on here. The springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. Think about that description. And rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So 40 days and 40 nights it rains. And along with that, the springs of the earth burst forth and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. Can you imagine what that water must have looked like? So much so that nothing escapes. But 13, on that very day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and who? Japheth. Good. Together with his wife and the wives of his 3 sons, entered the ark. They had with them every wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kinds, every creature that moves along the ground according to its kind, and every bird, everything with wings. Pairs of all creatures that have the breath of life in them that came to Noah and entered the ark. And when you think about that, one of the most important parts of God's relationship with what he created was what? The breath of life that he breathed into creation. And so I think this is another verse that points to God's grief again. Because he's telling us, I breathed this breath of life into all this creation. And because of its rebellion, because of its sin, I have to deal with it. I have to judge it. I have to take care of the creation that I made. But we're also told that the animals that come to Noah all have the breath of life in them as well. Verse 16 tells us that once all this happens, once all the animals come in to the ark, once he has every living thing in the ark, the Lord shut him in. Did y'all catch that? It wasn't like a Noah locks the door. It wasn't like Noah's family boards it up. It's the Lord shuts them in. Like you can just experience the judgment that God is having to pass on creation. That even in the moment that he's just saved everything, he shuts them in. It's not a pleasant boarding of the ark. It is the door is sealed and judgment is about to occur type of thing. For 40 days, the flood kept coming on the earth. And as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. The text note in here explains that it's about 23 feet. So think of the highest mountain that you've seen around here, and imagine it being 23 feet underwater. So imagine how much lower the rest of everything else would be underwater. How complete and total and utter this destruction that was brought upon the earth is. Now, did you notice the mathematical part there? You see, in order to be able to float the ark, in order to be able for the ark to never hit dry land, the water had to be deep enough that the ark would always float. So Noah had to build the boat to God's exact specifications. And because he did, the boat is indeed the proper size to continue to float with all the water that God places on the earth. Every living thing that moved on land perished: birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over all the earth and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. There's that grief again. Everything that God had breathed into died. Verse 22. Verse 23, every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and the animals and the creatures that move along the ground and all the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left and those with him in the ark. And we're got 2 more minutes, so we'll close here shortly. But I think sometimes when we read these stories, these events that occurred, we want to read into it that it's that our God is angry, that he's vengeful, that he's doing all these things to us. But in reality, if you read closely what the text says, what's God doing? He's grieving. He's grieving. Over and over, he tells us this breath of life he breathed into everything. He has to destroy it. He has to cast judgment on it. Because of the sin and rebellion that we brought into the world, he now has to judge everything because of us, because of our choices. What I see in verse 7, what I see in all these things in the Old Testament is God's grief. Because it tells us from the beginning, if we do these things, this is the way that sin has to be dealt with. This is the redemption story in the Old Testament. God tells us beforehand, don't do this rebellion, don't do this sin, because sin has to be dealt with. And we still do it. And remember, every thought people had was what? Wicked, evil. Every thought we had, not just 4 or 5 thoughts, not just our actions, every thought we had was evil. That's the depth of depravity that we were at this point in the story of God and his relationship with us. Verse 24 really speaks to the amazing amount of water and rain that was on the earth. Because remember, it rained for 40 days, for 40 nights, but after the 40 days and 40 nights of rain, there's still 110 days of flooding. There's 150 total days of flooding from this flood over all the earth. How many of you ever been on a cruise before? I haven't, but I hope to someday. What's the longest cruise anybody's been on in here? A week? How many of you been on a week? 2 weeks? Anybody been on longer cruises? 2 weeks? Good. What about 3 weeks?
Maybe.
No. Always one in the crowd. Okay, well, not counting him, anybody else been on a boat longer than a week? This family was on for 5 long months. 150 days on an ark with nothing but your family and a bunch of stinky animals. But that's what Noah was willing to do when God told him it was the only way.
It'd be hard not to sin.
It would be. We'll also see the results of the impact it had on Noah once he gets off the boat. You make a good point there. Because Noah really bombed it at the end, but 5 months on the ark with no dry land.